I don't know.
Are we all ready?
Am I ever? Am I ever? Well, good morning, everybody. We're talking, hopefully here, I don't know when we're going to work on it. First of all, it's great to see everybody here. I was worried. This is Promotion Sunday. And I was kind of worried about how many of y'all might be promoting up in another class.
Never.
Maybe somebody with some more class. I don't know how it might work.
Bedridden class? Or
Ambulatory. Let's say, welcome to the ambulatory Sunday school class. Yeah, it is kind of nice. We've been talking a little bit, Gary and I have been discussing possibility of moving our venue into a little bit smaller room. A little bit, not much, but a little bit smaller room than this. And trying a couple of things along those lines. I didn't get to tell him this. Gary hopefully is monitoring the feed here so he can get our suggestion. But I was thinking if we could find a room that had recliners.
I'll vote for that. You can wake me up when you want me to go.
Yeah.
That's a
Gordon,
very good suggestion.
Gordon, could I trouble you? Anyway, whoever happens to be a stir, please read the following verses. Anyway, yeah.
You might find silence today.
Well, it was probably the most relaxing thing. Somebody probably have to poke me. What were you saying? I don't remember. Where was I? Anyway, I don't know. That's something in the offing. Maybe something to look forward to. We'll see how that works out.
Probably everybody would appreciate it if we didn't have to set up this little area here and then fold it back up.
Yeah, I know.
You're over.
Yeah, it's a pretty good amount of work getting it set up and torn down and everything. So anyway, we'll see what happens. Things are rolling along. Hope everybody's had a great week. Had a busy one. We had our that was Gary making any comments about our recliners. We had our last Sunday through Tuesday, had our state career tech conference, which is always fun. I think it was my 39th time to go to that thing. I'm not going to get into all the stories of how it used to be. It's decent. It was Sunday afternoons, not much, but Sunday and Monday, it's all down at the convention center. And then Tuesday was interesting, all the different divisions and things where it all breaks up. We had every single room on every single campus had something going on. It was huge. I mean, how many thousand people attend that? It's a pretty...
Last Sunday night when the choir went to Collinsville for a practice.
Yeah. You went around.
I noticed that one, a huge facility there on the east side.
Wausau campus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Really big.
I have to take you on tour of that one these days. And I was there, I was actually there Friday. That's one of the two spots now that has a room big enough to hold everybody until it's attacked. And so Friday, we call it reunion. And first time we got to do it in person now for like 3 years. And it was, so we basically close everything. And everybody in Tulsa Tech all gets together in one place at one time. And it's really special. It's really cool.
Did you say STEM conference? Is that what you said?
So, well, that's part of it, actually, the State Career Tech Conference. Yeah, the STEM conference is actually part of that.
Oh, okay.
So, I mean, just give you, I forget how many it was. I forget, was it 8,000? I forget how many people. It's pretty big.
My daughter's going to be a STEM teacher this year.
And where's she teaching?
Tuttle Elementary.
At Tuttle?
Tuttle Elementary.
Okay. Yeah. Well, have her holler at me. I got every kind of resource at my disposal. she can imagine. And very dear friend of mine, one of my favorite people in the whole world. I'll tell you a story about her in a second here. She, when I first met her, and I knew I was going to like her, she's the STEM coordinator for Broken Arrow Public Schools. Yeah, boy, she's a great resource too. But yeah, Emily, first, they lived up the street from us, and remember when they were moving in, Lisa and I were walking by and kind of said hi and introduced ourselves. And Emily introduced us, said, "Hi, I'm Emily, and I'm the only person you'll ever meet that has over 30 recipes for vomit."
I'm sure that was true.
I knew I was going to like her. I knew we were going to be buddies. And anyway, at that time, she ran the patient simulation lab for OU Med School. And they have, these more or less, robotic or whatever kind of patient, but they can do all kinds of things, and throw up, and have all kinds of stuff. So anyway, she's a chemist by her original education, and she had that really bent sense of humor and everything. She had their dining room table, about this size or maybe a little bit, but anyway, similar size to this, but it was the periodic table of elements built into it, stuff like that. And fortunately, I got her one of her questions. She said, "Oh, you can drive an element onto elements." And she said, "What element is it?" I said, "Well, hydrogen, because there's a big H on it." So I was able to so anyhow, we have over the years have had some great stuff. What was one of our favorite jokes? It was about what was it about a couple of ions met one day, and one of them were talking one day, and one said, "I believe I've lost an electron." And said, "Are you sure?" He goes, "I'm positive." So, stuff like that. Anyway, they had two precious daughters, and got to be very close to them.
It's been so long since I've had chemistry, that one almost goes by.
I know. Oh, I've got a lot more.
We're going to lose the TV audience here pretty quick.
Yeah, we are. I think I better. Those of you watching on TV, thanks for bearing with us. We kind of wandering down the primrose path here today. We got kind of an interesting lesson, and it's interestingly enough because it kind of ties into some of the stuff I've been working with and doing in my work this week, and sort of some, if you will, sort of top level kind of how do you go about successfully trying to lead an organization. I mean, at the state level is one thing, but even just at Tulsa Tech, how do you go about leading an organization of the size and scope and diversity kind of a thing? It is so. I mean, there is so much stuff going on, and so much of it is there are the enormous dependencies, and yet there are significant independencies, and it's a very complex.
Takes a little bit of planning.
It takes some planning, and I tell you what, sometimes it takes some agility because the things that get you. I'm great with the plans. It's the stuff that falls outside the plans is where you can trip up. Those things that kind of happen.
Those are called adjustments.
Yeah. Well, for example, I don't know if I mentioned it or not, but a little over a month ago, we underwent a brutal cyber attack, and on a scale of which I've never had to cope with. I mean, I've learned about it, I even taught about them, when I was, and that's sort of in my subject matter area, but I've never actually had to live through one. And our IT people were beyond superb. It was as close to perfectly executed on their part as humanly possible, and very, very grateful for how that. But those little things that come along, and those are the things that's where the gray hairs come from. Anyway, a lot of interesting thought about that, and that's, believe it or not, is kind of what we're talking about today. We're in 2 Kings chapter 12. And we have a kind of an interesting little incident. I don't even call it an incident or just a tidbit, an anecdote, but an interesting glimpse into day-to-day operations, if you will, of the and an interesting thing in Israel to observe what we would call the church and the state. We in the U.S., of course, we are very careful to separate those two.
Not in the Constitution.
Hmm?
That phrase is not in the...
Not in the Constitution per se. The Constitution prohibits establishment of a religion or of freely, what's the word it uses? Free exercise there. But the idea is that, and boy, I'm going to wander down the weeds. I'm going to be careful, but the philosophy is that a secular government is a very good thing. When we look, of course, and the reason that got in there was actually at the insistence of South Carolina, among others. But they were tired of paying a church tax. There was in England. There is, of course, an established Church of England, and whether you attend the Church of England or not, you still support the Church of England via your taxes.
In 1967, 2 years we lived in Germany.
Yes.
There was a 10% tax. I think it went to the Catholic
That's
Church.
right. Well, it's either that or the Lutherans. I don't know.
Maybe in Luther.
But it probably depended on where you were in Germany.
Yeah.
Because before there was a Germany, which has only been in existence since the 1870s. It was largely the Holy Roman Empire. It was this various loose confederation of various kingdoms and duchies and whatever they were. But anyway.
It's too confusing to try and figure out.
Oh, I can't. No, you just try to. It's interesting to look at, but it's not the sort of thing I stick with very long. It's just like, who cares? But anyway, much of which was Catholic, much of which also was also, thanks to Martin Luther, was pretty staunchly Protestant and Lutheran, depending on where you were. But that's not uncommon, and so that's the reason that got in there. But the point is, and this is a really interesting point that I've is that a secular government is a very good thing, because it means that every person, as far as the government goes, is basically treated equally, if you will. But a secular society is a thing to be abhorred. I'll let you mull that for a while, but anyway, it's a little deep thought there, perhaps. But what we see today, obviously, in Israel, and well, at this point, what's left of the original Israel, which, remember, now is divided into the southern kingdom of Judah, which includes the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, along with most of the tribe of Levi, because since the northern kingdom, those 10 tribes, pretty much rejected the Lord, there wasn't much for the Levites to do, so they all came south too. But anyway, even so, there is that vestige of knowledge and worship of Yahweh, even though there were many times where the government in the northern kingdom actually actively tried to stamp out the worship of Yahweh. But in Judah, the southern kingdom, that never happened, although their relationship had its ups and downs. What we're seeing today, hi John, what we're seeing today is one of those moments where it's on the upswing, and one of those little revivals. The interesting thing is to watch how the secular government, if you will, the king, and the priests are kind of working together here. And so anyway, kind of an interesting little deal. So that's where we'll start. We're going to have a word of prayer actually before we get any farther here and dive in. Father, thank you for the time we spend together and the opportunity to study your word. I just pray you'll give us some stir our thoughts here a little bit, and as we look at some of the things that we do and the way we do things, I pray you'll perhaps give us some ideas or inspiration. More than anything, Father, I pray that you'll show us in this example of your word that we're looking at today, that we can see your hand at work, and give us the assurance, Father, that in all situations, and even those that may seem a little bit mundane to us, that Father, you're still you're at work and you're in control, and you guide everything, Father, for your glory, for your name's sake. And thank you for using us to accomplish those things in Jesus' name. Amen. So, like I say, 2 Kings chapter 12, if you've found that, and where we're going to be diving in. There's been an awful lot of history that we haven't. We're kind of skipping here as we go through the stories. Kind of a succession of kings. The northern kingdom is going through kings on a wholesale basis. They've had I think they had like 2 or 3 in the space of like 7 months. They just couldn't have been the king was not good for your life expectancy. They'd come along and it was anyway. Wasn't much future in it, and plus Syria, Aram. You know, we've encountered them the past couple of weeks in different ways. I still, when I come across that word Aram, I just kind of automatically don't even say it and would rather say Syria. That's who they are, and that's especially in modern context to help you understand who and where these folks are, and the fact that not much has changed over the years. In fact, even what's happening over in Syria today is almost kind of harks back to this time, because just about the time where we're picking up our scripture here, another power, actually, well, we probably consider one of the superpowers, a new superpower kind of emerged called Assyria. It's not the same bunch. These folks are from more north and east, but the war broke out, and anyway, the Assyria, this much larger, stronger group, absolutely eradicated Aram, which is why we consider now, we don't even use the word Aram anymore. If you mention Damascus as the capital of what country?
Syria.
Well, it used to be Aram, but you didn't say that, did you?
Yeah.
So, which is basically thanks to the Assyrians. And
Well, you wanted it in historical context.
well, no, not at all. I wanted to make the point that we don't that Damascus is just automatically Syria. You know, we don't even think about calling that part of the world Aram anymore. That's just lost to the pages of time, thanks to the Assyrians. The Assyrians were very interesting how they operated. They weren't a real cohesive group. There was actually a whole bunch of folks that kind of got together and decided to go steal. You could just kind of make a sort of a little league of criminals here, and decided that they were going to make a living by going out and stealing from everybody else. And that's essentially what they did, and they got really good at it. They were brutal. They were just incredibly violent and incredibly brutal. And so in the springtime, they would just kind of go out and steal everybody else's crops. They would look, if you could imagine them today, if you could envision thousands upon thousands of old beat up pickups and with old rusty camper shells and stuff stacked, tied to the top, kind of grapes of wrath looking, Winnebagos and a bunch of just old beat up junk. Thousands of them at a time coming across the desert. Okay, and they started off with empty trailers. And And that's basically who they were, how they operated. They were kind of nomadic and, as a not particularly cohesive as a group, but they were really good at what they did. They were just a bunch of land pirates, basically, was what they were. And they would come in and raid everybody, and gather up what they could, and then they'd go back, spend the winter, where it was they came from, and then weather warmed up, they'd start all over. And that was just kind of the way they operated. It absolutely terrorized everybody. And that was Assyria. And they're at work at this time frame where we are right now. They are already, at work. They're, doing their thing. They have pretty much already conquered Aram. They're working on the northern kingdom pretty hard. But we're going to focus on the southern kingdom today. There was a very interesting incident which we've kind of skipped over. Jezebel's granddaughter winds up becoming, if you will, the queen regent of Judah, the southern kingdom. We saw, we talked about when we were looking at Solomon, he decided that as it wasn't all that uncommon, you're going to make an alliance somewhere. One of the ways you do that is marry the king's daughter, and then you kind of got kind of some relationship going there. But anyway, similar thing kind of happened between Judah and Israel. I mean, you can think about it. That was kind of crazy, but it did. Anyway, but she was at least as bad, if not worse, than her grandma. She was an absolute nasty human being named Athaliah.
Kale.
And yep, that was her middle name. And anyway, she winds up basically usurping power. Actually went through and tried to kill all of the, and thought she had successfully killed off all of the other claimants to the throne, not knowing that the high priest Jehoiada had hidden young Joash, I forget, he was just a child at the time, and hidden him in the temple. And of course, she had no interest in the temple except to put another Baal statue in there somewhere. Anyway, but it all worked out. Ultimately, they crowned Joash the rightful king of Israel. Athaliah didn't like it much, but that was too bad. And the louder she protested, the quicker they were out looking to make him a noose and take care of Athaliah. And I think he was about 6 years old at that time. Obviously not in a position where he could effectively reign, but fortunately Jehoiada was there and was able to guide him into maturity, and he actually became one of the better kings. He's not a great king. By the time they get to this point, I guess you could almost say maybe he's about the best you could expect under the circumstances. There are fortunately a couple of very good ones yet to come, but also some of the worst ones as well. But anyway, in the historical context, that's where we are. But he has an interesting issue that comes up. I'm guessing at this time he's probably in his early 20s. So, I mean, he's been king since he was 6, but hasn't actually been acting as king probably for all that terribly long. But anyway, that's where we are. So, chapter 12, let's someone read, anyone who happens to be awake, read verses 4 and 5 for us, please.
Then Joash said to the priest, all the dedicated silver brought to the Lord's temple, census silver from vows, and all silver voluntarily given for the Lord's temple. Each priest is to take it from his assessor and repair whatever damage is found in the temple.
So apparently, over the years and over the period of time, which we've kind of, been looking at all these different things, Elijah and Elisha and all this stuff going on, a long period of time here, and at that point since Solomon, we're a few hundred years down past Solomon now. The temple is not exactly new. A 200-some-year-old structure probably going to require a little work every now and then. It's going to at least need a coat of paint. After 200 years, you think it might need a coat of paint and a few things. It's obviously, in need of some repair and some restoration. And at some point, it kind of comes to Joash's attention. Maybe it's the fact that he had to look at that thing, and maybe it's like, things getting a little bit run down. The lawn needs to be mowed, among other things. It needs to be cleaned out. Flower beds need to be cleaned up, and it could use a lick of paint. Some of those doors don't close right, and you know what I'm saying. And so, now, it's interesting. Joash, of course, isn't allowed inside what we think of as the temple itself, the holy place, sort of the Holy of Holies. He's not even allowed in there. So he can only kind of see that from the outside. But anyway, he knows that the priests are very aware of the conditions on the interior. And so, apparently they get together and talk about it and say, we need to work on that. Now, he alludes to a number of different things that I think are very interesting. First of all, he talks about well, let me just point out one word. What precious metal is mentioned here?
Silver.
Silver. Do you remember, I don't remember if we made a big deal about it or not, but when Solomon was the king?
Gold.
Yeah, they were on the gold standard back then. Okay, what was the comment? Do you remember the comment made about silver?
Kind of worthless.
Yeah, silver was so common, it was just like paving stones. They didn't even think about silver. What do we got now?
Silver.
Where'd gold go?
Got shipped off to the Assyrians.
Exactly right. Well, it got shipped off first of all to the Assyrians and to the Egyptians and pretty much everybody else that came up and wanted to beat up on them. You remember we saw that a couple of weeks ago where they were, trying to make a treaty and they gathered up all the gold and everything. There wasn't anything left, so now everything's silver now because that's all they've got. They're down to that. I mean, it's still nice. Silver's pretty nice stuff, but it's a step down from gold. And anyway, but that's the medium of exchange. So Joash mentions the dedicated silver, and I'm assuming that is just the regular offerings that one would bring to the temple when they come in. You would go into the temple. What you're going to bring your burnt offering, your sin offering, or whatever whatever your purpose was to be there. You would bring your the animal sacrifice, but you would bring money as well, and well, it was your tithe. And understand, we talk about tithing today in our time. We're just dubious. It's a good guideline. I hesitate to make that our silver standard, if you will. Notice I didn't say gold. Anyway, but there were actually three separate 10% tithes prescribed in the Old Testament. This would be one of them. Okay. So anyway, he also mentions the census silver, which again is kind of another thing that you go up there, you're supposed to pay, if you will, your offering or whatever based on how many people are in your family, and you do that. And then there was silver from vows. Somebody would make a vow of some kind, and to ratify that or whatever, then there would be again an offering made. So it's a reference to the various kinds of offerings, including just a voluntary or what we call free will offering. Just someone felt moved to bring an offering, for the Lord. And there were, they had as well, and this is something that we're familiar with, special programs, special things they needed to do, and they'd have a special offering. Right now we have, of course, to finish paying for our building project. And they did those kinds of things too, and that was included in those. So anyway, so the orders were, the distinction was the priest to take that from the assessor. A better translation maybe is accountant, because that's who that was. Whoever was keeping track of that stuff, and pay to restore the temple. Any questions? I think it's interesting to me to note that it's the king who's instigating this. I wonder why it wasn't the priests. And especially having come across Jehoiada, who, is obviously a pretty good guy. You think a lot of him. But I wonder why he didn't. But perhaps because, remember, all the priests actually lived there. Joash was actually raised in an apartment there in the temple complex. So I don't know. Anyway, but whatever. It was the king who instigated.
I mean, it was the leaders who crucified Jesus. They haven't changed a whole lot.
No, they haven't. No, they haven't. No, straining at gnats and swallowing camels. It's kind of been the way around it. Well, anyway, it's. I just think it's interesting the way that worked. Now, we do get a timestamp here in the next one. Someone read 6 through 8, and we'll see how that goes.
But the priest never started repairing the temple. So in the 23rd year of his rule, Joash called for Jehoiada and the other priests and said, "Why aren't you using the money to repair the temple? Don't take any more money for yourselves. It is only to be used to pay for repairs." The priests agreed that they would not collect any more money or be in charge of the temple repairs.
So, it's kind of an interesting situation. This mentions the 23rd year of Joash's reign. Well, he started his reign when he was 6 years old, so he's 29 at this point. And I don't know, I'm not entirely sure how many years have elapsed here between when he first, asked for that work to be done and where they are now. But it's obviously been a pretty decent period of time. It's been several years anyway. Excuse me, I beg your pardon, he was 7 when he became king. I think I said 6. He was 7 years old when he became king. So this would make him 30 years old at this point. Whatever, I mean, that's splitting hairs, but you get the idea. And nothing's been done. And he said, wait a minute, we talked about this. This was on our plan. I imagine it's probably the way we like to operate. It was one of those 5-year plans, And they had their big 5-year plans, and they had a banquet. And, they all had their speeches and everybody, and they had their PowerPoints and all. And there's their 5-year capital improvement plan that, they're going to really, beautify Jerusalem. And Chamber of Commerce, and, it was quite a big deal. But I guess at the end of 5 years, Joash is looking around and said, we're going back over that 5-year plan. Yeah, we did that. Wait a minute. What do we do in the temple? Look at that. Absolutely nothing. It still needs a coat of paint. It still needs, some repairs and some work done to it. So, he kind of held these guys accountable. Apparently what was happening was that the priests, and which was okay because it's permitted, certainly under the law, they were deriving their income as much off of those gifts and everything, and apparently, possibly, maybe they were getting a little bit ahead of themselves, And so anyway, so Joash had a really great solution for that, and said, we're not gonna, you guys just leave it alone. Don't mess with the accountants. Are going to give that money to me, And so he basically took over the work. Jehoiada, though, verse 9, Mary, if you don't mind reading verse 9, Jehoiada had a kind of an interesting little solution as well.
Then the priest Jehoiada took a chest, bored a hole in its lid, and set it beside the altar on the right side, as one enters the Lord's temple. The priest who guarded the threshold put into it the chest all the silver that was brought to the Lord's temple.
So they've taken care of what could have possibly been a pilferage problem or an accounting problem or an accountability problem. And I think that may have been probably the bigger deal. I don't necessarily think anybody was doing anything wrong. In fact, I kind of get the feeling as I read through this that nobody was intentionally doing wrong. I think it's more of a sin of omission happening here more than anything else. And I think the fact that the way they had things set up, two things, and in fact I was talking about one of these this week, two things are at work here. First of all, the controls in terms of how they collected the offerings and how those things were taken. There wasn't really any checks and balances in that. There wasn't any real accountability per se. So they were taking, I would imagine they were taking a pretty substantial amount of money, and it wasn't being misappropriated. It was, I don't think, it was just that there wasn't anybody that was really keeping track of it and really, saying where it went. There just wasn't any real reporting or any real knowledge about that. And so the fact that work's not getting done on the temple, I don't know. And the other thing was, who was actually in charge of working on the temple? Whose job was it?
According to the earlier verses, it was the priest.
Well, yeah, but they had other things to do, and that there were assignment, and that wasn't really in their job description. They were butchers. I mean, probably more than anything else, they were butchers. They were taking all the sacrificial animals and offering them and going through all those steps and procedures. They had a number of things. They were doctors. If somebody said, "Hey, could you come up and look at this place on my arm? Make sure it's not leprosy," or "I got a big stain on the wall of my house I'm kind of worried about," and so those were the sorts of things. There were a number of other things, and so they had their other jobs to do, and construction, facilities management and stuff wasn't really part of their job. At least it wasn't. Maybe you could have seen it that way if they'd have thought about it. Back in the good old days, they had a whole bunch of them that their job was to carry and set up and tear down the tabernacle. Maybe they could have kept them. I forget whose sons those were, but which sort of sub-tribe of Levi's responsible for that. But that was their job, and maybe they could have kept them as more in the facilities role. But whatever. Anyway, the problem is that you don't want even the appearance of impropriety. And you say, I don't think there was any real impropriety. I just don't sense it. Maybe I don't know, goody two-shoe, whatever you want to call me, but I don't see any necessarily. I don't see anything wrong. I don't see any embezzlement or anything like that happening. I don't see anybody with their hand in the till. I just don't think, but there's no way to prove that there wasn't. They didn't have the kind of system that could make it clear to everybody, the kind of transparency as we like to call it today. There's no way that you can unequivocally say, no, I didn't do that. So when you have that shadow of a doubt, you've got a problem. And so that needed to be fixed. And the other thing was somebody needed to be responsible. Nothing will ever, ever, ever get done anywhere in any organization of any size, including a household, until somebody decides to actually say, okay, I'll be responsible for that. I'll take that job on. And it's funny how you can sit there and look at, some glaring, obvious issue that needs to be addressed, and find something easier to do instead. It's human nature.
You get used to seeing it.
Well, that's true. That's true. It didn't bother the priests that much because it looked that way since they started. It wasn't that big of a deal.
You go into a home and that you don't live in, and you can see what needs to be refurbished. But people living there, that's just the way it is. And
Yeah, just get used to it.
yeah.
You remember Paul Kill?
That's my time, I think.
Well, yeah, I know some of y'all are way too young to remember that, but Mom, Paul, that's my favorite thing. And I feel like poor Pa Kelly walk out that door and hit that one board in the porch and come up and lose and slap him in the face. I'm gonna have to fix that one of these days. I feel like Pa Kettle more often than I'm willing to admit. But anyway. You get the idea. So I think Jehoiada has a pretty interesting idea. It addresses part of the issue now that there is a good amount of accountability, if you will, on the people who are responsible for collecting the money. I think it's kind of interesting. Meanwhile, we've got Joash kind of taking the responsibility, making it a government project rather than a church project. Those are horrible terms to use, but you get the idea. 10 through 12, someone read that for us.
Whenever they saw there was a large amount of silver in the chest, the king's secretary and the high priest would go bag up and tally the silver found in the Lord's temple. Then they would give the weighed silver to those doing the work, those who oversaw the Lord's temple. They in turn would pay it out to those working on the temple, the carpenters, the builders, the masons, the stonecutters, and would use to buy timber and quarried stone to repair the damage to the Lord's temple and pay all the expenses for temple repairs. So
I think it's really interesting. Now you've got, and you see how this accountability process works. You've got both the king and the high priest, or their people anyway, now teaming up and verifying, double checking the amount. And apparently it's a pretty substantial amount of money coming in there. And so now they're verified, so there's no question about how much they have. And I think it's interesting now how they allocate that. It mentions, some various craftspeople here. But I guess what they do, they come in and they know what needs to be done. They submit their bids or whatever, and they're allocated, okay, how much you need, and they go fine, and they get, and there's no, that's it. There is still that amount of trust there that they're allocated certain resources to do what they need to do, and apparently, guess what? It's getting done. And it's getting done well. I think it's interesting to notice what they're, among other things, masons. This thing was basically, if you remember the way it was built, all the stone was quarried for this thing outside of Jerusalem. And it's mentioned in one of the things they wanted to do when they built this thing was that there would not be any sound of iron tools. Can you imagine? Now, I've been on a few construction sites in my time, I cannot, in fact, most of the time I have to have ear protection. It's not a quiet, and I was just imagining like that building that last one we just got through doing. I remember all the processes going on there, all the work that we did. I can't comprehend what that would have been like had it been done in complete silence. Now, I don't know how you would have done that.
Well, assuming that you use pegs and stuff, and not nails
Yeah,
for the wood,
yeah.
you could use mallets, but they'd still make some noise.
Man, it still makes noise. I just think, how in the world did they pull that off? How on earth did they pull that off? And anyway, it's just an amazing thing. But can you imagine those massive stones like that? What kind of a deterioration has taken place? I don't know that the core temple itself was necessarily too adversely affected. Parts of the U.S. Capitol are original, which would have them built about 1800, opening around 1800. So that would be, 222 years old here or so, and are still there, and they're still a part of it. Now, substantial additions have been made since then. One of the, I guess what was the original Senate chamber was later the Supreme Court chamber and is still intact. And I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it was Statuary Hall. What's currently Statuary Hall was the original House chamber. And remember, not only were those, the first two basic edifices, and there was kind of a little corridor that linked them. It wasn't very pretty, to tell you the truth. And remember that got burned down in 1812, or 1814 rather, by the British during the War of 1812. It got pretty substantially burned. The structure was still there. They have the big masonry structure, and it's still the original there today. In fact, they have a little spot. I remember in this old Senate chamber, they have a little spot back there where you can look and actually see the scorch marks from when the British burned it. White House, same way. But anyway, interesting deal. So I guess what I'm saying is I imagine the core part of the temple is probably reasonably intact, but there's a whole lot of other structure and stuff that has been added to it over the years. Obviously, the quarters for the priests and whatnot, where Joash was raised, crying out loud.
Built out of sandstone, maybe?
I'm not sure. I'm not really 100% sure what's more common over there.
Granite or something.
Well, there is a lot of igneous rock what am I trying to say? Granite and marble. There are a lot of a lot of limestone. There's a lot of, I'm not sure what's indigenous. Sandstone, very possibly. I would think. I don't know all that's there.
Sandstone would have the opportunity to go away.
Yeah. Sandstone would definitely erode over a pretty good period of time. And I don't know what kind of concretes and things like that they had, but obviously that probably had more deterioration than the stone itself. But anyway, they mentioned the timbers where you can see how wood, exposed to the kind of conditions that it is here is probably not.
I wonder if they had some with it. Never mind. What difference?
Anyway, it's interesting to reflect on the fact that ultimately these craftsmen were the ones who were kind of holding the bag on getting it done, and they got it done, and there wasn't really substantial, if you will. Nobody was standing there, basically. There was a great amount of trust involved, and I think again, in any organization, I think number one, you've got to have that transparency. You've got to have those things so that everybody knows that everybody's on the up and up, and there's ways to make sure that nobody can say anybody's doing anything wrong, because you've got systems that make that clear. You have somebody who is in charge, or I like to call him, the word I like to use is champion. A couple of things that I have going on at work have not been as successful as I would like to see them be, simply because there isn't anybody there on the ground to kind of be the champion. To kind of be, if you will, I don't want to say the squeaky wheel or whatever, but you got to have somebody that will be responsible for that, and especially will keep people up the chain informed, and if they have needs, to let them know. And if those needs aren't met, to kind of squawk a little bit. Learning how to do that is very essential, how to do that well and gracefully and effectively. But anyway, but that champion is important. So we have that now. And then ultimately, you've got to have the trust to put it all together. And it's ultimately those people who are standing there with the mallets, with the saws, with the skills, with the know-how to do what needs to be done. And ultimately, everybody, it comes down to them. And so they're the ultimate level of trust. And I see that happening here. And I like it. I find that very encouraging. 13 or 14, somebody please.
However, no silver bowls, wick trimmers, sprinkling basins, trumpets, or any articles of gold or silver were made for the Lord's temple from the contributions brought to the Lord's temple. Instead, it was given to those doing the work, and they repaired the Lord's temple with it.
So, there were a lot of other things. Hey, wouldn't it be nice to have a new silver service? And wouldn't that be pretty? They already had, apparently that stuff was still there, and it was still, you ever heard the expression that says, if it ain't broke,
Don't fix it.
Don't
fix it? Okay, well, it ain't broke, folks. Now it'd be nice. Wouldn't it be nice to have some new gold trumpets? To play. They sound so nice. I've seen a few trumpets in my time that got beat up. Cornet, big old dent in the belt and stuff. You see that beat up, dented up French horns and whatnot. But you know what? They still play about the same. I'll be honest with you. They don't look real pretty, but they play about the same. And I don't know that even this stuff is beat up, but I think the point is there's no diversions here. That they said, look, is this what we've dedicated this money for? And we're going to focus on the actual building project, not get so worried about, we call it the construction project, FF&E, just fixtures, furnishing, and equipment. And we're not going to get too worried about that stuff right now. Let's not even, in fact, we're not even going to worry about that at all. Let's focus this money on that. We get done with this, maybe we can come on, maybe then we do need some more bowls. I don't know. Some sprinkling basins and wick trimmers. But let's hold off on that till we get this job done. Everybody's cool with that. 15 and 16.
The men in charge were honest, so no one had to keep track of the money. The fines that had to be paid along with the sacrifices to make things right, and the sacrifices for sin did not go to the temple. This money belonged only to the priests.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting now. They're being kind of careful to follow the law in how a lot of the money is allocated. The sin offering, in particular, anything that was given as a sin offering did not go toward construction of the temple. But there's a couple of reasons for that. But on a practical basis, that was where the priest's income was to be derived. That was their money. And did you mention anything in here with the priest grumbling that they needed a raise?
No.
That they didn't have enough? No, they're doing fine. They're doing fine. So obviously their needs are being met very well. Work being done on the temple, is it getting done? And I love I think the translation that you read specifically said that the workmen were honest. It's an interesting word. My translation, a couple of them I've looked at, they were men of integrity. But I think it's one of the most important things, and it's always been kind of a philosophy to which I subscribe, is that you just make sure that folks know why something needs to be done. And then get out of their way, and let them figure out how.
This was a very strange lesson.
Yeah, kind of.
I mean, we've been going through all kinds of whodunits and we got rid of this guy and this guy's bad and then here in the middle, all of a sudden we talk about integrity and rebuilding the temple.
Yeah, we've got a management lesson.
Yeah,
Kind of, really. It's all of a sudden we go, well, and when we started today, boy, we could have spent days on all the whodunits. Which king stabbed which other one in the back and which one did this and that, and Athaliah. Man, we could spend a week on Athaliah alone. And, it just goes on and on. Then all of a sudden, like you say, there's just this la, 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 la. It's kind of, yeah. And we're kind of, we get this lesson in just a mundane, just day-to-day operations, just a management lesson, And
I just thought it was really strange.
no, it is odd. It is odd. Well, I tell you, in a way, it reminds me. The thought occurred to me earlier. It's a lot like First Chronicles. The first 9 chapters of First Chronicles are these absolutely interminable genealogies. Oh my gosh! And blah blah and it just goes on and on. And I ought not to make light of it. The Holy Spirit inspired that, and I don't mean to question his judgment in doing it the way he did. I have never been able to probably entirely appreciate his purpose in doing that. I'm sure that I will when I'm in a bit wise reform here. But all of a sudden in the middle of that, just when you're just about to give up, you run into that little story about Jabez. You remember the little prayer of Jabez? That was kind of almost a meme of a thing, if you will, a few years ago. It was pretty profound. And in the middle of all that stuff, all that, just where you're just about to just fall off the face of the earth, you get this little Jabez thing, and it's like, that's kind of cool.
Well, maybe the point of this was that you got all these kings that so many of them are worthless.
Mm-hmm.
They're killing each other left and right. And you got some real honest people here, if you just that are still part of the church. I call it the church.
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
And
we understand.
And if you give them a job to do, they're going to do it. They're going to do it well, on time, and no cheating.
Yeah, you can trust them.
And maybe that was the, I don't know. Maybe that was the point, is that,
and in the midst of all that other chaos, with all this other, intrigue and whodunits and all this weird stuff going on, we saw a similar thing a couple of weeks ago with that little slave girl, not going to name it. And here's this young girl, who's been basically captured in a raid and taken off to be a slave in a foreign country from the northern kingdom, which is actively rejecting the Lord, and she is this bold witness for the Lord, and you see his purposes being carried out. It's just like, so and this is kind of the same thing in the midst of all this other stuff going on. Isn't it cool to see that there's still people who love the Lord and are willing to work and do the things that he's requiring them to do? So I spent most of yesterday depressed. There was a great article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday about the coming war with Taiwan, or the coming war over Taiwan, and the particular position in which China finds itself and why such a war is probably inevitable. And I don't like that word inevitable, especially when I start thinking about getting into a ruckus with China. There isn't anything to be pretty about that. But they made a pretty strong case, but of course I spent the rest of the day fretting about it. Anyway, but there again, You know, sometimes we look at the situation we're in, we look at the world around us, we look at the things that are happening, and we just shake our heads and say, it can't possibly be any worse, but you know, there's some good things happening. And I think sometimes, you know, we get so focused on that half-empty glass that we forget about the half-full part. And we forget where the Lord is actually at work. Not in the earthquakes, not in the tornadoes, not in that stuff, and that's still small.
The earth-shaking event of the last, for our country, so in the last several weeks, is Roe versus Wade being
Yeah, absolutely.
overturned. I mean,
Absolutely. Oh yeah, absolutely. And the aftershocks continue and will for some time to come, I'm sure. So yeah, it's, you know, there's significant things happening and all around us. And the Lord's in control. We just got to remember that. Sometimes He needs to remind us. And here in the middle of all this other stuff is this little snippet of the management lesson, you know, how to restore a temple. Just like, you know, everything else, life goes on, and the Lord's glorified. I forget which psalm it was, but the line really hit me about, you know, about the Lord, you know, doing these things, quote unquote, for my name's sake. Okay? It didn't have anything to do with us or anything or making us anything special. It's the Lord's reputation. And He is very keen on keeping it in spite of us. So anyway, great stuff. Well, we go back to the intrigue and the violence and the backstabbing next week. Don't be disappointed. There's plenty more bloodshed to come, and I feel like a sort of a Alfred Hitchcock, you know, promising an even better murder next week, you know, and as he would say, until then, good night. So anyway, that's our thing today. Until then, have a great week. Thanks for being with us. Thank you all for not choosing to promote, you know, into the next level, whatever that would be. I'm very gratified that you hang with. We'll have another fun year. Then next August we'll see where we are. And anyway, so again, no folks at home, thanks for being here. Love to have you. Any comments? Put them in the comment section on the video. Love to hear from you. So let's have a word of prayer. Let's be dismissed. Father, thank you so much for a really interesting little piece of your work. Father, your Spirit inspired these words to be written and applied to our hearts. He who dwells in us, the author himself, interprets and applies this to us. And thank you, Lord, that we can really derive some really interesting things from this. Some practical things, I believe, and some pretty deep things in understanding who you are and your nature and just getting to know you better. Thank you, Lord, for the time we get to enjoy together. Pray you'll bless the rest of this morning as we worship you in truth, in your presence. Inhabit this place, Father. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen. All right.